is an hour.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful crowd we have this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Linda Knox, and I am co-chairman, along with Stephen Mullen, of Library Hour. And tonight we have a very special guest who has written a very, very interesting book. I've read part of it, but not all of it yet. And we are very, very happy to have him with us tonight, Mr. Michael Smerconish. And to introduce Mr. Smerconish, I'd like to call forward Mr. Robert Flood. Bob, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. This is the Union League's Library Hour are great forums for events like this evening, whether we're talking about events in the past or timely topics of today's talk and Flying Blind by Michael Smerconish. Some background about Mike Smerconish. Michael, as many of us know, hosts a radio show on Mondays through Fridays from 5:30 to 9 a.m. on WPHT 1210, the Big Talker. And we can hear his booming voice throughout the waves. I've gotten calls from friends and associates that hear him up in northern New Jersey, in the hills of Maryland, and I'm sure the signals of 1210 reach even deeper. He also is he writes a weekly column that appears in our very own Philadelphia Daily News every Thursday, and that's actually picked up in over 300 newspapers across the country. Michael has been profiled nationally due to the writing of his book on a number of national programs. A few of them, the O'Reilly Factor. He was on Hannity and Combs, Kudlow and Kramer. The list could go on. He's spent a lot of time since the release of his book over the past 40 days talking to groups like this, large groups, and he hasn't been spending as much time at home with his wife Lavinia and his 4 children, and we're fortunate to have Lavinia Smerconish here with us this evening. If we could welcome Lavinia. Lavinia is also a phenomenally successful real estate broker with the Prudential in the Main Line area of Philadelphia. And also, as a side note, Michael's mother, Flo Smerconish, is an equally successful real estate broker in the Doylestown area. So we have Bucks County covered as well as Montgomery County. The proceeds of Mike's book tonight the proceeds of Mike's book are all going to the Lower Makefield Memorial. And that's an area in Bucks County that many of us know that was hit extremely hard in the 9/11 attacks. And that's a great area to live in Bucks County, to commute to Manhattan. It's a hop, skip, and a jump to get to drive to Trenton and then take the train to Newark and the path into the former Trade Center or up to Penn Station. On a personal note, I used to work in Manhattan at the South Tower, the Trade Center, and left just a few weeks prior to the attacks. So we all have personal involvement with 9/11. It's our generation of Pearl Harbor. But the 2 of my former associates were from Lower Makefield, Don Havlish and Jim Berger. And Jim Berger was a very close friend. He was a guest of my wife and I here at the Union League, and I know the families are extremely appreciative of Mike's generosity in donating the proceeds of his book. On some lighter notes or snippets of Mike's life, he grew up in Doylestown, Bucks County, had a wonderful upbringing with his family, and he's a hardworking guy, worked at McDonald's. He references that on his radio program. This morning he referenced a newspaper delivery. He also he was a football player in the super powerhouse Central Bucks West football team, and he earning his varsity letter holding for point after attempts. But anyway, he did it. At Lehigh University, he was Phi Beta Kappa. He earned a degree in journalism and government. Went on at Penn Law School. In his second year of Penn Law School, he ran for the State House, the 143rd District, which encompassed part of his hometown in Doylestown. Fortunately, came out on the short end, but he did very well in his communication, organizational skills, and received a lot of attention. And henceforth, Senator Specter, asked him to run his re-election campaign for southeastern Pennsylvania, and that was a success. Following that, the Rizzo campaign. As a political deputy, and you can imagine at that point when Rizzo was running against Mayor Good, that was fireworks. President Bush, first President George Bush, asked him to serve as the regional or Mid-Atlantic director for the Housing and Urban Development, which is a tremendous amount of responsibility, tremendous a number of people reporting to Mike for his direction and decision-making abilities. In 1992, he joined the Beasley Law Firm, and as a trial lawyer, which is a highly successful law firm here in Philadelphia, a good trial lawyer, and he just a few years ago went into to pursue his real enjoyment and love in journalism and talk radio. Going back to when I referenced his running for political office, it was literally 18 years ago that we were here at the Union League when Michael was running for office. We were having a fundraiser, and Michael had Thatcher Longstreth, Councilman Longstreth, as his honorary campaign person or chairman. And my job was to introduce Thatcher that night. And we were up in Lincoln Memorial Room with the statue of Lincoln behind us and Amor Patriae Ducat, the Union League's motto, and Gettysburg Address. And I remember being very nervous in my introduction to Thatcher, and I had to say something funny about his bow tie and Argyle socks, as he always wore. But now it's my turn to introduce Mike. So please help me welcome the man that is known for his rear profile, hairless, back of his head on the back of buses and billboards all over the land. Please help me welcome Michael Smerconish.
Thanks, Bobby. Thank you, Bob, for an awfully nice introduction. Did he begin that by saying that he was profiling me? Did I hear you use that word? I've done a lot of speaking in the last month about flying blind, and it's awfully nice that as we sort of wind down the publicity tour for the book that we stop at the Union League of Philadelphia, because I'm a member of the league. It was Bob, although I think he may regret it on some days, who proposed me for membership here many years ago, and I have such warm memories of the league. I love this place, and it's sort of home turf for me. Bobby mentions Thatcher Longstreth, and I just have to tell you one story. We're all getting older, but about 20 years ago, it was our tradition that a group of us who were then single would spend time every December at the Pennsylvania Society. And I'm sure a number of folks in this room know what the Pennsylvania Society is. It's an annual weekend for a lot of politics and a lot of business to be transacted, but it takes place in New York, and yet is called the Pennsylvania Society because the folks who attend are all Pennsylvanians. And we had a tradition for a couple of years of going up to New York and staying at the Union League of New York. We had reciprocal privileges. The rooms were clean, they were well appointed, they were cheap, we were broke, everything was perfect. And one particular night, a group of us stayed up rather late on a Saturday night. Some would say that there was alcohol involved. Complaints were made to the front desk. The following morning, we all drove home to Philadelphia and were no worse for the wear. When we came back to Philadelphia, we thought we'd have a little fun with the fellow who was a league member, in whose name we had reserved our room, Dave Singer. Dave, I'm sure, appreciates the mention on C-SPAN. Bob's father was then the president of the Union League, also named Bob Flood. A guy with a name like Smerconish can't keep all those Roman numerals straight, but you get the picture. And in any event, Bob procured a piece of the official Union League letterhead that said, Union League of Philadelphia, Office of the President. And so a letter was dispatched that particular day to Mr. Singer, who'd rented the rooms, and it was signed by an individual who was the chairman of the Committee on Member Conduct. Doesn't that sound so Union League-ish? I don't know if there was a Committee on Member Conduct, but the letter went out and it said, you've been summoned to a meeting of our committee because there have been allegations made that you were involved in conduct unbecoming a member of the Union League of Philadelphia. So we'd planned that he'd be summoned at a particular day and a particular time. And he was nervous as all get out when he received the letter. And just for icing on the cake, and this is what made me think of it, is because Bob invoked the name of Thatcher Longstreth, our old good friend who we miss. I called Thatcher and I said, we're involved in a practical joke of enormous proportions. We need you to pull it off. So on this particular day that young Mr. Singer was summoned to the Committee on Member Conduct, as he approached the front door of the Union League, who was standing there with a very foreboding expression but City Councilman Thatcher Longstreth, who looked at Dave and said, just tell him the truth. Well, they walked into the Union League and came up to, one of the fancy rooms at the end of the hall. There was a secret knock on the door, and when Dave opened the door with Thatcher at his side, there we all were inside, the same crew who'd been in New York, cigars in hand and a couple of cocktails, and it was the perfect culmination to what was an extraordinary practical joke. So now you know why I'm so thrilled to be at the Union League of Philadelphia talking about a very serious subject. I want to discuss with you a book that I never set out to write. You're going to get sort of the Cliff Notes version at this particular juncture, and I'm going to rely on some audio that helps me tell the story, and the audio is all contained on a CD, which you find in the back of the book. You met Lavinia, my wife. We have a home on the west coast of Florida, and this past March, we were traveling to Florida for spring break with our 4 children, and our children are Lucky, aged 4, Wilson, aged 6, Michael, who is 8, and Caitlin, who is 16 going on 30. I'd had some unpleasant experiences with U.S. Air, just in the category of poor service, in my humble opinion, from Philadelphia. And I had talked about them on the radio, and a number of listeners had said, you should really try Spirit Airlines out of Atlantic City. It's cheap, it's on time, you'll have a good experience. And so that's how we found ourselves at the Atlantic City Airport, headed to Fort Myers on a particular day last March. We walked from the car up to the ticket counter. We checked in. We had electronic tickets. And the woman, very pleasant, who was checking us in said, "Which one is Michael Jr.?" And I pointed to my 8-year-old son with his Pokemon backpack and his Game Boy in his hands and ketchup on his chin. And she said, I don't know if that will do. And I said, well, what exactly are you referring to? And she said, well, he's been selected for secondary or random screening. And I said, well, if it would be all right with you, I'd be thrilled to take his place. No worries about that. And she said, yeah, that would be acceptable. So she handed me a boarding pass with a big red X on the front of it. I took it. Because we have a home in Florida, we don't pack clothing. So we travel light and we never check bags. And I was traveling that day, I remember it well, with a cloth briefcase. And the only thing inside the cloth briefcase was a brand new copy of Sean Hannity's new book, Deliver Us from Evil. Now, you have to picture the scene that we walked up to the security checkpoint, and I'm now the individual who not only takes off his shoes and walks through the magnetometer, but I'm selected for the more thorough examination. And when they open up the cloth briefcase, what pops out but Hannity's mug on the cover of his new book? How threatening could that be? I didn't complain about the process. I believe that we all have an obligation in the war on terror to do our small part. I thought it was a bit ridiculous, but I blamed Osama bin Laden. I cursed him under my breath. I got on the plane and we headed to Florida. 1 week later, it was time to now do this in reverse. You know that I host a daily morning program here in Philadelphia. What you may not know is that each of our homes are also wired for sound. And so when in Florida for spring break, it's a vacation for the family, but I'm loath to be off the air. I have a studio in our place in Florida, and I remain on the air. There's a piece of electronic equipment that allows me to be on the air. It's called a Comrex Matrix, and if you didn't know what it was, you'd be puzzled by it. It's an electronic device that looks rather menacing. We had technical problems while I was in Florida that week, and our engineer said, bring home the Comrex Matrix. So now, in coming home from Florida, you see where this is going. I'm traveling with the cloth briefcase. I've read the Hannity book. I leave it in Florida, and inside now goes the Comrex Matrix. We arrive at the Fort Myers airport, check in curbside, and there's now a repeat of what transpired in Atlantic City. In other words, the person says, which one is Michael Jr.? I explain that it's my son. Would you like me to take his place? That would be fine. And as we now head toward the checkpoint, it occurs to me that I'm traveling with the Comrex Matrix. And I say to Lavinia, you know, this is going to be an added hassle because I'll have to explain what all these wires and electronics are. Would you carry my briefcase? And she did. And she carried the briefcase and went through without incident. Me, I got stopped and had to go through the full process of inspection. Again, didn't necessarily mind it. Thought it was a bit ridiculous, though, because now I had twice negotiated myself out of, or frankly, into the random screening process. And to the extent the Comrex Matrix was a bomb, I've just handed it off to my cohort. Didn't say anything about it, got on board the plane, and flew home to Philadelphia. Now, about a week later, the first of the 9/11 Commission hearings on television began. And this was a hearing that you'll well remember because there had been some reluctance on the part of the administration to produce Condoleezza Rice for public testimony. She testified behind closed doors for 4 or 5 hours, but now the issue was her testifying on television. The administration initially said no, then they decided to produce her. When they did produce her, it was a very much watched event. And the eyes and the ears of the nation were captivated by a series of exchanges. Richard Benvenisti was the person that I recall initiating them about the PDB, the President's daily briefing from about a month before 9/11. What did he know and when did he know it and what did that document say? And the following day, all of the headlines and all of the stories about the 9/11 Commission were consumed with the issue of the PDB, because for the first time, the title of what the president had been told a month before 9/11 had been publicly revealed. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something akin to bin Laden determined to attack within the United States. But that was not what caught my attention in that particular hearing. What caught my attention in that particular hearing was the questioning by a Philadelphian by the name of John Lehman, St. Joe's guy. I know a number of the people who are in the room are well acquainted with John Lehman, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy at age 38, and an individual who was put on the 9/11 Commission not at the behest of the White House, not because the Democratic leadership wanted him to be there, but because John McCain wanted to have a set of eyes and ears on the 9/11 Commission, and it was Lehman that he selected. What I found interesting, and John Lehman, like the other 9/11 commissioners, was only given 10 minutes of floor time. I found it interesting how he used his time. He asked a series of questions of Condoleezza Rice that were loaded with facts, and her answers were inconsequential. But his questions and the composite of his questions told a pretty menacing story about, candidly, how the Clinton administration had been asleep at the switch, and so too had the Bush administration in the first 8 months. And I don't want to get into the whole political dialogue of one versus the other, but he was trying to make the point that there was very little difference between the relative positions of the administrations on a variety of issues. Give a listen just to refresh our memories of some of what John Lehman had to say to Condoleezza Rice.
Were you aware that INS had been lobbying for years to get the airlines to drop transit without visa loophole that enabled terrorists and illegals to simply buy a ticket through the transit without visa waiver and pay the airlines extra money and come in? Were you aware that the INS had quietly, internally, halved its internal security enforcement budget? No. Were you aware that it was the U.S. government established policy not to question or oppose the sanctuary policies of New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, San Diego for political reasons, which policy in those cities prohibited the local police from cooperating at all with federal immigration authority? Were you aware, to shift a little bit to Saudi Arabia, were you aware of the program that was well established that allowed Saudi citizens to get visas without interviews? Were you aware of the activities?
We've edited out Condoleezza Rice's answers, but trust me, they were nondescript, and they're contained in total on the CD. I just wanted to give you a feel for his style of questioning. It was this question, I think I say in the book, that sort of knocked me out of the Barca-lounger. Give a listen.
Before I go to Justice, were you aware that it was the policy, and I believe remains the policy today, to fine airlines if they have more than 2 young Arab males in secondary questioning, because that's discriminatory?
That's a mind-boggling question. And she had no knowledge of what he was talking about. But think about it. This is Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy, now member of the 9/11 Commission, saying to the National Security Advisor, are you aware of the fact that we had this policy and still have this policy that if you select more than a certain number of individuals of a particular ethnic stripe out of line at any one time, that's discriminatory in the eyes of our government? I heard him ask the question, and of course I reflect on my own experience because I couldn't for the life of me understand how my 8-year-old son has been singled out for this random screening on the flight down to Florida and then coming back. So I then sought out John Lehman to ask him, because Condoleezza Rice hadn't offered much in her response, what in the world was he talking about? I remember the day so well because the gentleman who's running the audio for me and runs all the engineering aspects of the morning program is Pete Nelson. Pete, by the way, thank you very much for playing that role again here tonight. Pete and I together came in Easter weekend on a Saturday so that I could interview John Lehman because that was the only time that had been offered to me. And Lehman was on his farm in Bucks County. I was in the studio out on City Line Avenue. There were no handlers. There were no intermediaries. I think that worked to my benefit because he was very relaxed and he was very candid. And I wanted to know from him, what in the world were you talking about when you posed the quota question to Dr. Condoleezza Rice? Here's what he said. You said something to Condoleezza Rice. Is it the policy of the Justice Department to fine the airlines if they have more than 2 Arab males in custody? What were you talking about?
A testimony a couple of months ago from the president's, past president of United Airlines and the current president of American Airlines that kind of shocked us all. They said under oath that indeed the Department of Transportation continued to fine any airline that was caught having more than 2 people of the same ethnic persuasion in a secondary line for questioning, including and especially 2 Arabs. That's really the source, because of this political correctness that became so entrenched during the 90s and continues in the current administration. No one approves of racial profiling. That's not the issue. But the fact is that Norwegian women are not, and 85-year-old ladies on aluminum walkers are not the source of the terrorist threat. The fact is, our enemy is violent Islamic extremism. And so the overwhelming number of people that one needs to worry about are young Arab males.
Now, when he told me that in no uncertain terms, I knew that I had something worthy of writing up. I publish my column typically on a Thursday for the Philadelphia Daily News, and I'm allotted 650 words, and I'm sure that doesn't mean anything to anybody in the room, but just for sake of comparison, I recall, again, sitting in my home on Easter Sunday and writing approximately 2,500 words about my exchange with John Lehman, calling Zach Stahlberg, the editor of the Daily News, at home and saying, I think I'm on to something here. I've had this extraordinary conversation with John Lehman that I think is really going to resonate with readers and help them understand how we're going about this crazy airline screening process. So I turned in a special column, and it ran on Easter Monday. It was promoted on the front page of the newspaper, and it was picked up in cyberspace and spun all over the place. Ultimately, my work on this subject would be picked up by National Review Online as well as the New York Post. That particular day happened to be the day that the Phillies opened Citizens Bank Park. And I tell you that because a lot of aspects of this story, Flying Blind, and the first thing that I said was I never set out to write any book, much less this book. But a lot of aspects of this book are a combination, and I say this in the book, Michael Moore, Forrest Gump. Michael Moore with manners, let me make clear. and Forrest Gump in the sense that I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to be able to question individuals about this subject, and candidly used the strength of the airwaves of the radio program to get access to people that I otherwise would not have been able to speak to. At Citizens Bank Park that day, I ran into Arlen Specter. Senator Specter and I have a relationship. I told him what I'd written in that morning's Philadelphia Daily News. He hadn't seen it. I gave him the short version of the fact that John Lehman had explained to me over the weekend that the reason that in this random screening at airports, the reason that 85-year-old women with aluminum walkers and 8-year-old kids like my own are being selected has to do with the fact that it's all about not wanting to offend and not really with a security purpose in mind. Senator Specter was disbelieving. The next thing that happened, because my pieces were picked up in those journals and newspapers that I described, is that I was invited to do an appearance on Kudlow and Kramer. Jim Cramer extended the invitation for me to come on CNBC. So I explained to a national cable audience exactly what I've just explained to all of you. The sequence of events, my flying experience, my interview with John Lehman, what I'd learned on the subject. The following night, I got out of the shower at home, the telephone rang, picked it up. It was a relative from Florida who said, "Boy, did you take a drubbing tonight on CNBC?" And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, didn't you just see Jim Cramer?" Now, this is one day after my appearance, has read a statement on the air issued by the Department of Transportation about you. And among other things, they say that you were wildly incorrect with the assertions that you made here last night on national television. I immediately began an email exchange with the Department of Transportation with their flack, and I asked him, and you've got to, it's my favorite part of the book, you've got to see the email back and forth between the two of us. It's unedited, it's in the book, in which I say, "May I please have a copy of the statement that you issued to CNBC about me, in which you apparently said that I'm wildly incorrect?" They refused to provide it to me. And to the contrary, they said, "As a matter of fact, if you write anything else on the subject, would you kindly share your column in draft form with us before it goes to press?" To which I responded, "It's not the Soviet Union and I don't work for TASS or Izvestia." But they had some strong concerns about that which I'd reported. I hadn't made it up. I hadn't pulled it off a right-wing website. I'd simply reported what a former Naval Secretary and now 9/11 Commissioner had told me. Well, here's what happened next, and this is the more Gump aspect of the story. By pure happenstance, Southwest Airlines had just announced that they were coming to Philadelphia, and my radio station was welcoming Herb Kelleher to Philadelphia. They were holding a business breakfast. It was at the Marriott Hotel in Philadelphia, and my responsibility that day was to literally do my morning radio program from the hallway outside the ballroom, where 500 business people, at the invitation of our radio station, would be there to welcome Herb Kelleher. During an extended commercial break, I was to run inside to the ballroom, go up to the podium, and be the person to introduce Kelleher to the crowd and to the city of Philadelphia, run back out to the console, and continue doing the radio show uninterrupted. That was my assignment for the day. Little footnote to the story. That did occur, and I'll never forget when I walked up to the podium and I did the introduction. Kelleher comes up now, and Herb is a wonderful guy and really a renegade, good fella in my view. I have to stand around at the podium now for the obligatory handshake and the photograph, and when I do, he leans over and he whispers in my ear, "May I smoke?" And I said, "Pardon me?" It's 8 o'clock in the morning, by the way. He said, "Do you mind if I smoke?" And I'm thinking, what control do I have of the whole dynamic? 500 people in the room, and I'm a cigar smoker. I said, "Sure, you want to smoke? Go ahead and smoke." I left the podium. He stood there and chain smoked for the next 30 minutes while he delivered his remarks, which you don't see too often in the year 2004. In any event, before the smoking experience, he was a guest on my radio program, and almost as an afterthought, I raised this subject with Herb Kelleher, the founder and the chairman of Southwest Airlines. Give a listen. Do you mind if I hit you with an unrelated to the goodwill sort of conversation we're having and ask you a 9/11 question?
Not at all.
All right, because, and this is interesting, in the 7 o'clock hour, and I've got to be mindful of the time so that we stay on schedule, but this is so darn important. In the 7 o'clock hour initially, I had John Lehman, former Secretary of the Navy,
Yes.
who's a member of the 9/11 Commission, on the program. Lehman, last week with Condoleezza Rice, is asking her a series of questions, and he says to her, were you aware at the time that you came into office as the National Security Advisor that there was a policy in place, and I'm paraphrasing her, but he said where if the airlines singled out more than 2 individuals of a particular ethnic stripe at one time for questioning, they ran the risk of being fined by the Department of Transportation. And Condoleezza Rice said that she'd never heard about that. I interviewed Lehman later, and I said, Mr. Secretary, what the heck were you talking about? And he said, political correctness has become so pervasive that the airlines have been operating under a threat that if they didn't handle their screening in a PC manner, they could get fined. Have you ever heard anything about that?
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, it goes back to the Clinton administration, where the Justice Department said that they were concerned about equality of treatment with respect to screening, and my understanding is that that's why the random element was put in. In other words, we just choose people at random as opposed to picking them out for some particular reason. And that, of course, caused a great many more people to be screened. And
just so we don't offend somebody else.
Well, I think that was the root of it, yes.
It's insane.
Yeah.
There's the explanation. I mean, you want to know why individuals with no commonalities are selected in the random screening process, why individuals like my 8-year-old son or John Lehman's example are selected for that process. Herb Kelleher tells you the story. And I then continued on this path of pursuing the subject, because when Kelleher told me, with all of his background, that there was merit to that which John Lehman had suggested, I decided there was something here, that a story that needed to be told. And although I bring to the table no necessary expertise in airline safety, that I was as well suited as anybody to tell it. So what I did next was I procured the litigation files from the Department of Transportation that had been initiated against the airlines. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, and I assume that many of you are hearing this for the first time, in looking at the whole subject of how we go about screening at airports, I learned that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there were 3, and now the number is up to 4, airlines that were actually fined millions of dollars by our government because our government perceived them to be involved in discriminatory conduct. Let me be specific with you. United and American Airlines lost 2 airplanes apiece and a combined total of more than 30 of their own personnel on 9/11. They were the airlines victimized on that tragic day. And yet, in the aftermath of 9/11, our Department of Transportation initiated discrimination complaints against both of them that were settled for $1.5 million apiece. In those files, you see a scenario like the following. A pilot who is in the cockpit, who's ready to pull back from the gate. He's got to keep a schedule. He's also got a statutory obligation to see to it that anyone who's perceived to be, and here are the magic words from the statute, inimical to public safety, is removed from the aircraft. So the scenario is that there's a knock at the cockpit door, and the pilot is told either by someone from the flight crew or someone in law enforcement that so-and-so in 3C is of Middle Eastern descent, they've been acting in a suspicious fashion, and their name is either on or similar to a name which is on a federal watch list. What would you like us to do? And in those circumstances where the pilot says, well, would you please remove that individual, question them further before allowing them on this or any other airplane, our government perceives that to be discriminatory and has initiated legal proceedings against the airlines. The airlines fought this process but ultimately settled. I wish they hadn't. American put up the best of the fight among any of the airlines, and I think as a lawyer I can understand why they didn't want to incur the black eye that might go with fighting a discrimination lawsuit, although I wish they had hung tough instead of settling it. Department of Transportation hates it when I refer to this as a fine. It's money that literally the airline has to pay into a fund and used for sensitivity, or as I describe it, kumbaya training of all of their personnel. So in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it's United and it's American Airlines, and at the very same time that the government, the DOT, the Department of Transportation, headed, by the way, by Norman Mineta, we'll come to him in a few moments, at the very same time that the government is initiating these quote-unquote discrimination actions against the airlines, the DOT circulates a memo from Delta. And they say, look at what Delta is doing. Delta has the right answer. Delta sent out a memo, talking of peace, love, and understanding, and we all need to get along, and we can't hold it against any ethnic group, in particular that which occurred on 9/11, so make sure that we treat everyone fairly and similarly. I tell you that because it was United, it was American, $1.5 million apiece. Next, Continental Airlines, $500,000. And as my book went to press in the early summer, it was Delta, $900,000, getting stung with the exact same kind of an enforcement action. There are two interconnected but different issues that I discuss in this book. One of them is the screening process that John Lehman was referring to, that Herb Kelleher was referring to, that involves my 8-year-old son. Related but distinctly different is what I'm now describing, this process of how these pilots are in this untenable position of having all this responsibility for keeping the airline safe and being on time and so forth, but also seeing to it that anybody who poses a security risk is removed from the aircraft. And those are the situations that have yielded the fines that I discuss in detail in the book. To me, that's the most egregious thing that you'll learn in reading Flying Blind. Something else that I learned, and by now you know that the P word, profiling, is not a dirty word in my vocabulary. I like to refer to it as terrorist profiling. I mean, here's the thesis. The 19 hijackers on 9/11 had a variety of commonalities. They had their race, they had their religion, they had their gender, they had their appearance in common. And I think that it's foolhardy to not take that data into account in trying to prevent a repeat of 9/11. And to the extent that anyone feels differently about the subject, I ask that you take a look at page 17 of the book. Page 17 of the book are the mugshots, all on one page, of these individuals. I defy anybody to take a look at page 17 of my book and tell me that we should be pulling out 8-year-old boys and 85-year-old women with aluminum walkers. Truth be told, this page was my choice for the cover of the book. And Running Press, wonderful publisher, and I'm very grateful to Running Press of Philadelphia for publishing Flying Blind in such a short time period. Running Press was concerned that folks might not want to walk around, particularly walking out of an airport bookstore, if that were the cover of the book. To which I, of course, responded, now you're getting politically correct with me. There's another story in the book that I want to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you about a Senate hearing where I testified and wind down and hopefully take some of your questions. One of the stories that I learned in doing the research for Flying Blind is, and my chapter in the book calls this The Real Story of Flight 93. And you know, by the way, that is chapter 7. You know, of course, as Pennsylvanians, that Flight 93 is the flight that crashed in Schwenksville, Pennsylvania, in western side of the state. There was something that distinguished Flight 93 from the other 3 flights on 9/11. Not only the fact that it crashed, and not only the extent that we think there was a passenger revolt on that flight that exceeded anything that went on in the other flights, but also that from a terrorist standpoint, Flight 93 was shorthanded. Flight 93 had 4 terrorists on board. The other airplanes had 5. There's been a lot of conjecture over time in the last 3 years who was to be the 5th hijacker or the 20th hijacker overall, the hijacker on Flight 93. We know, and when I say we, I'm relying on the 9/11 Commission, we know who was to have been on Flight 93. Flight 93 was to have had a man named Mohammed Khatani, on that airplane. Now, what became of Mohammed Khatami? Mohammed Khatami sought entrance to the United States on August 4 of 2001 at the Orlando International Airport. Mohammed Khatami was a Saudi national who came before a very alert customs officer by the name of Jose Melendez Perez. And if you're looking for a real hero in this whole subject matter of flying blind, it's Jose Melendez Perez. He sized up Mohammed Khatami, and he relied on street smarts and human instincts, and he thought, this guy's a bad seed. He told the 9/11 Commission, quote, he just gave me the creeps. The review process began with the fact that he was a Saudi national. And Jose Melendez Perez, in weighing a decision as to whether to turn back Mohammed Khatami, is counseled by his colleagues that these Saudis have a lot of clout, and you better think twice before you send one of them packing. Well, Jose Melendez Perez did it anyway. He thought that the guy was probably here as an assassin. He looked at his build, he looked at the way he was groomed, he didn't like his demeanor, and the whole composite of this information caused him to say to Mohammed Khatami, sorry, but you're headed back. And that's what became of him. What we now know is that at precisely the moment downstairs at the Orlando International Airport that Mohammed Khatami was given his walking papers by Melendez Perez, upstairs, there to pick him up, was Mohammed Atta. And that's the conclusion come to by Senator Bob Kerrey and others on the 9/11 Commission. When Jose Melendez Perez testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, and his extraordinary statement is repeated verbatim in the book, he told that story. There were a lot of victim family members present who gave him a huge ovation, and the 9/11 Commission members thanked him for his extraordinary service to the country. So, to those who say, in fact, let me be more specific than to say to those, I'll be crystal clear. When the book came out, it was reviewed in the Boston Herald. The Department of Transportation statement on my book, Flying Blind, is that I possess, quote, a warped sense of American values. So initially I was wildly incorrect. Now I have a warped sense of American values. I don't know if I'm not sure which way the line is going on the graph. To those folks at the DOT, and now at the TSA, and anyone who has a role in the subject matter of this book, I say, well, I guess Jose Melendez Perez has a warped sense of American values as well, because all that I'm advocating is exactly what that man did on August 4, 2001. And Senator Bob Kerrey, in the 9/11 Commission hearing where this gentleman appeared, said, you know, we thank you, because presumably your conduct spared a direct hit on the White House or on the Capitol, because Flight 93 was shorthanded from a terrorist muscle standpoint, and who's to say that if they had one more body, they'd have kept the passengers at bay and completed their mission. So it's hard for me in a soundbite. That's why I'm so grateful to be able to be here at the Union League with C-SPAN watching to offer the full explanation of exactly what I'm advocating, but in a name. It's Jose Melendez Perez. I continue to pursue this whole subject of political correctness wreaking havoc on airport security, and I did it in a relatively short time period, and I used the power of the airwaves to recruit guests to the program that I would otherwise not have been able to discuss this subject with. Let's, Pete, skip ahead to cut 7, because he's a character and it was kind of interesting. Anybody who called the show that had played a role or would play a role in any matter of public discourse, I questioned on this subject. Rudy Giuliani, John McCain, Tory Clark, they all came through in the late spring and early summer, and I would question each one of them as to why aren't we looking for terrorists who resemble the 19 hijackers on 9/11. Tomorrow I'm interviewing Dick Cheney at 2:30 for my radio program. I'll broadcast it on Friday, and I will be asking the Vice President exactly that question. I mean, I support this administration, but it's happening on their watch and it's not right. Cut 7 is Ed Koch, just by way of example of how the subject was a recurring theme of the radio show. Give a lesson to Mayor Koch. I'm pleased to be able to welcome back to the city of Philadelphia the former mayor of the city of New York, that, of course, Ed Koch. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning. I agree with what you have said as it relates to examining people online. I mean, it's nutty that we should worry about, are we pulling out too many Arabs if, in fact, the people who are committing terrorism happen to be Arabs? That doesn't mean that the vast majority of Arabs aren't peaceful, but I would bet that whether you're Arab or non-Arab and you're on a plane, you want to be sure that people who fit a profile of terrorism to a greater extent than others are given special attention.
What I found as I would talk about this subject with policymakers is that they'd all agree with me. John Mica, who is the chairman of the House Aviation Committee, was on my program, and any time that I would engage someone in a one-on-one conversation and explain my perspective, they'd all agree, but nobody wants to be the champion for this cause. Nobody wants to stand up for fear of the, the public ridicule and scorn that goes with being identified as the one for profiling. I'm not running for anything, so I speak my mind. I only wish that there were a champion out there who would say the sort of things that I've been saying, because the one reaction that I hear most often from people about my book is, thank God someone has written what I've been thinking. I want to wrap up and tell you how my review of the subject, and it was really just over a couple of month time period, concluded. I would educate, inform United States Senator Arlen Specter as events would unfold. When I'd learn something, I'd call Senator Specter, I'd get him back on the radio show, and I would say, Senator Specter, I just learned that they fined American and United $1.5 million each. This is insanity. Finally, he said to me, I think this deserves a public airing. And I'm willing to call a Senate hearing on the subject matter that so interests you, and he did it. June of last year, I got on a Metroliner, went down to Washington, didn't know what to expect. He asked me to testify, and I was thrilled to be there. What was interesting was the night before going down on the train, the phone rang, and it was Senator Specter, and I was scared to death that all of a sudden the hearing was going to get called off. He told me that Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, was no longer returning his phone calls. And Mineta was not returning his phone calls because I'd been writing about the fact that part of the problem, not all of the problem, but part of the problem that I discuss in this book begins with the mindset of Norman Mineta, the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, and a man who is vehemently opposed to the thoughts that I have in this book. He was part of the internment process of the Japanese in World War II. He carries those scars with him. He thinks that the 85-year-old woman with the aluminum walker and the 20-year-old Saudi national are deserving of the exact same level of review in flying, and I do not. I wanted to interview him in connection with the book, but he wouldn't speak to me. To be fair to him, one of the chapters of the book contains a speech that he delivered to the Arab community in Detroit in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, where I reprint it verbatim so that his side of this story is told, and then I respond to him. In any event, June of this year, it's a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee. Arlen Specter has called the hearing. Richard Shelby of Alabama is presiding. There are half a dozen members of the Senate who are there, and so too is yours truly. One of the other witnesses that day was the top lawyer, the general counsel for the Department of Transportation, and Senator Specter asks him, will you please tell me the facts of those cases that caused you to fine the airlines? You got to hear this. This is cut number 11.
Take one of the investigations and tell us what the underlying facts were.
Well, Senator, I don't mean to be evasive about this, but because these resulted in mutually agreed upon settlements, what the facts were was not resolved through an administrative law judge or ultimately by the department or reviewing courts. The Aviation Enforcement Office presented the facts in one instance in a complaint, and then in the other instances in discussions with the carriers. And the carriers, in some instances, did not agree with those facts, but ultimately there was agreement as to a resolution. In terms of the individual facts, I'm not sure that that it's easy in a forum like this to try to relitigate or go through all of them, nor have I prepared at the level of being able to present, this is what our case was, or this is what...
Mr. Rosen, I don't understand your response.
That kind of sums up. That's the Arlen Specter we know and love. I'm sitting in the Senate hearing room, chomping at the bit, because I've read all these litigation files. I can't wait to explain what they contain. So, cut 12, I take the opportunity to do so.
Senator Specter, may I speak to that, sir?
Sure.
You had asked earlier, Mr. Rosen, to speak with specificity about any one of the cases. I've read the litigation files to the extent that they're publicly available, and I've read those 11 different complaints. I can tell you about one of them, and I think that it displays some of the problems. And I've detailed this in my statement. It's the case of Jihad al-Shafri, a self-described 32-year-old Arab American, a naturalized American citizen of Jordanian birth. According to his declaration, which accompanied the complaint, he worked for a defense contractor helping to build missiles for the military and possessed a secret-level security clearance. November 3, 2001, so it's the fall of '01, he was refused entry while trying to board an American airline flight from Boston to Los Angeles. I took note of the fact that in the litigation files, there were a large number of flights from Boston to Los Angeles which were subject to the enforcement action. Well, that's the same path as one of the flights on 9/11. In the complaint against American, it states that Mr. al-Shafri was denied boarding after responding to a page and reporting to an American counter. There, he was greeted by an American employee and a U.S. Marshal. He was told that the pilot had denied him boarding on the flight. He informed the American employee that he had a secret-level clearance. He was nevertheless told he was being denied passage. Quote, "I was calmly contesting the pilot's decision when a state trooper arrived and asked me to move along and to deal with him. I was humiliated to be confronted by a state trooper in full view of the crowded boarding area. He missed his flight. He was upgraded to first class on the next plane." Well, that's the perspective of the complaint filed by the DOT against American. Now, here's what American said, and I think it suggests that there's more to the story. American said that at least one other passenger had reported what appeared to be this man's suspicious behavior to an American gate agent. Unfortunately, that's not defined, what was suspicious. Additionally, American said that the federal air marshal advised the pilot in command that the passenger had been acting suspiciously, had created some kind of a disturbance, and that his name was similar to a name on the federal watch list. So here's what was known to the pilot at the moment that he had to make this determination. 1, he was 2 months removed from the worst act of terrorism against the U.S. ever. 2, that terrorism had victimized his own employer, American Airlines. 3, that the point of origin of those flights was this same airport where he now sat, Logan. 4, the destination of the flights on 9/11 was L.A., which is where he was headed. 5, the hijackers were, to a person, young Arab males. 6, there was at least one passenger who was ill at ease with this man and who was acting in what was described to the pilot as a quote-unquote suspicious manner. 7, that the federal air marshal advised that the passenger at issue had been acting suspiciously. 8, that the passenger had a name similar to one on the federal watch list. And yes, number 9, let's not be afraid to say it, that he probably resembled the appearance of some of the 9/11 hijackers. And the question becomes, when faced with those 9 criteria, was it appropriate for the Department of Transportation to come down on American Airlines with an enforcement action, to question the judgment of the pilot who, after all, not only has to be protective of security, but to get off the ground and fly that plane? And I suggest that it was not.
I think in a nutshell, that's the whole story. And you know, you write a book, you have regrets. I have no regrets about what I explained to the Senate. That's the issue. And that pilot, for him to incur a fine on behalf of his airline, is reprehensible on the part of our government. I told you when I began that I didn't set out to write a book. I would not have been comfortable in earning any money from the book. I've described myself as sort of a one-armed paper hanger based in Philadelphia trying to change this policy. And I knew that I wanted whatever proceeds would come to me from flying blind to benefit a 9/11 charity. I just wasn't sure what the appropriate charity was. There's something called the Garden of Reflection that's being built in Lower Makefield Township. As Bob Flood described, Lower Makefield, Bucks County, lost 17 folks on 9/11, and there's a wonderful group of people in that community which was particularly hard hit. Victor Saraceni, who was the captain of United Flight 175, which hit one of the towers, his widow lives in that community along with their 2 daughters. And they have a funding shortfall in trying to get this Garden of Reflection off the ground, and consequently the advance that I was paid by Running Press and any proceeds that I'll be paid thereafter all go to the Garden of Reflection in Bucks County, which gives me license to say to all of you, go buy the book, Flying Blind. And thank you very, very much for... Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm mindful of the hour. I don't want to keep anyone here longer than they need be. If there were questions and we spent 10 minutes doing it, that would be fine with me, and I'd be happy to answer anything. The folks from C-SPAN have asked, could you kindly use that microphone? So if you just come forward, perhaps one at a time. Yes, ma'am, come on up. But use that microphone.
This is slightly different from your book, but my experience last winter was that I met 3 different pilots from 3 different airlines who fly domestically, and they had a lot to say about passenger screening in that it was more or less cosmetic. Anyone who had $75 and didn't have to speak English could gain access to any plane in almost any airport to gain anything on a plane. It didn't depend upon the passengers taking something threatening or dangerous onto an airline. Do you have any knowledge of, or did you come across that kind of situation, or
I think
your
the only
comments to that in
the only
your
thing of substance
writing?
that I can offer to you on that is that by employment group, the one group of individuals that I hear the most from about the book are pilots who are very complimentary. I guest hosted Bill O'Reilly's radio show on Monday in 450 markets across the country, and it spurred, because I discussed the book, a whole wave of emails, and again, pilots who say, thank God someone is exposing this, and you don't know the half of it. Well, I still don't know what the other half is. I only know this half, but it seems to me that those that I've heard from are in agreement. By the way, what I advocate is something akin to what the Israelis do with El Al. And I had that experience in flying last year to Tel Aviv. And, you know, in a word, they don't just look for bombs, they look for bombers. And I think that that's the strategy that we need to employ. I hope that answers your question. It's the best I can do.
I think probably the other half of the story is on the ground at the airport.
Oh, I think you're probably right. Thank you for your comment. Yes, ma'am.
Is what you're doing going to work?
I don't know. 2 weeks ago, not this week, but last week in Time magazine, there was a story that gave me room for optimism. It was a story about how there was a program initiated at Logan in Boston that was, in Time's words, that was going to involve elements of profiling. And it had been initiated by a state trooper from Massachusetts. His last name was D. Domenico, I think. I forget his first name. I immediately tracked him down, put him on the radio the following morning after I saw Time magazine, and I said, please, I'm so excited to hear this. Tell me what it is you're doing. What they're doing is taking into some consideration human factors, but not the criteria that unified those 19 hijackers on 9/11. And unfortunately, I can't tell you that I see change coming. That's as far as it's moved so far. And that's why I go out. I mean, you know, we have 4 kids. I'm out every weekend. I'm out any night that I'm invited to speak. This is a great opportunity for me on C-SPAN because I know the sort of people who watch this. And we got to change this policy. But it hasn't been discussed in the context of the campaign so far. I don't even hear border protection discussed in the context of the campaign. I had on my program this morning a fellow named John Podesta, who runs the Kerry campaign in Pennsylvania, and I said, you know, you'd really strike a chord with folks if you'd start talking about tightening the borders and the sort of subject matter that I've written about in here, but everybody's afraid. Get them one-on-one, they'll have the conversation. Anything else? Yes, sir, over here.
I was a Navy pilot for many years, and knowing my friends that went to the airlines, I'm very comfortable with them being able to handle a firearm in the cockpit if worst came to worst. I get the impression that it's being made extremely difficult for these folks to qualify. Do you have any feel for whether that's true or not?
Yes, that is my impression as well, and that's another one of the examples that's been raised with me by the pilots who reach out for me and say we've had to jump through hoops even trying to obtain a firearm properly for protecting ourselves. One more, if anybody has one.
Michael, thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
You said that the chairman of the Secretary of Transportation was not returning Senator Specter's phone calls. That was June. Your hearing was June. It's now October. I presume you haven't heard anything more from the DOT, or you would have told us. Has anybody, is Senator Specter pursuing this? Are his calls getting returned? Do you expect anything else from the DOT?
Well, they're dismissive of me. I mean, you know, I think, would like to just portray me as some type of an extremist. I mean, what a cheap shot that in the Boston Herald they would say that I possess a warped sense of American values. Anybody who would take the time to listen to the 50 minutes of remarks that I've just delivered on this subject and come to that conclusion, I'd love to meet. Because I think I represent a relatively balanced view, and I think that there's a lot of support for the sort of things that I've been saying out there. Now, to answer your question specifically, Senator Specter sent a communication to Norman Mineta recently, which I've seen, in which he told the Secretary that he thought there needed to be some tangible review items that could be taken into account. In other words, remove some of the subjectivity of what's fair game and what's not as we try and protect the airlines. And I don't know the Senator Specter. In fact, I think he probably would disagree with me in some respects. Here's my view. My view is that I'm not of a mindset that when you check in at an airport, there's one line for young Arab males and one line for everybody else. But I do want to confront the reality that individuals who are similar to Thurston Howell III were not responsible for 9/11. You know, no one with whales on their pants living in suburbia with a haircut like mine was responsible for that act of terrorism. And as far as I know, Al-Qaeda hasn't recruited anybody who fits that prototype. I want that information to be at the disposal of law enforcement. I want them to be able to take into consideration who paid cash for their ticket, who's flying one way, who's flying alone, in addition to the commonalities of the 19 hijackers. And I think that those commonalities should be tiebreakers. There is, and I don't want to get too far into the legalese, but in the book I explain it, and there's an appendix section of the book where the documents that I quote and rely upon are all here for you to take a look at. And there's something that the DOT uses called the but-for test. They say to an airport screener, if you would not be pulling someone out of line but for their race, their ethnicity, their gender, or their appearance, you're violating the law. I disagree with that test. I think that we need to employ tiebreakers, and the commonalities of those 19 hijackers ought to be the tiebreakers. That's as concise of an explanation as I can offer. Thank you to Jim Mundy and to the Union League and my good friend Bob Flood for hosting me, and to all of you and to C-SPAN for showing the interest in my book. I'm really appreciative. Good night. And thank you. Thank you very, very much for having me. I appreciate it very much.